Go. Thank you very much.
Good?
Good.
All right, well, Ben's pretty much taking care of the introduction for the most part, but I'd like to welcome you guys to this workshop on the Internationalist Perspective group. My name is Thomas Lewis. I'm a member of the Platypus Society, and I'll be moderating. I'm very fortunate to have Alan Milchman here from Internationalist Perspective. In addition to being a member of IP, Alan has been active in Marxist theoretical and political work for over 40 years. He has published in political journals, especially Internationalist Perspective, as well as, for example, Rethinking Marxism and Historical Imperialism. The focus of his theoretical interest has been the history of the communist left and anti-Stalinism, and especially developing the implications of the publication of manuscripts for Marxist critique of political economy, their critique, and the theoretical vistas opened by communization. So Alan's going to read some prepared remarks from somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes, if necessarily have to speak that long. And then we'll open up the room to something around an hour, depending on the languages remarks, for questions. And again, as Ben mentioned, try to keep the theme of the intervention in mind. Anyway, without any further ado, Alan.
Thanks, Thomas. Well, I won't read anything, but I will talk. The one problem I think I have is not knowing to what extent anyone is even familiar with internationalist perspective. It's not simply that we probably fly under the radar screen, which to a large extent is true, but I would feel more comfortable if I even had a sense that some of you are familiar with our positions. Failing that, I have no problem in explaining them briefly, really briefly, and perhaps doing a little bit of history. So if that seems warranted, then let me do it that way. We go back to the mid-'80s as a group and as a publication. Our last issue was number 57, so it's been a while. But we come out of the tradition of what I would call the historical communist left, by which I simply mean those groups that split from the Third International in the 1920s. Those groups that saw the counter-revolution emerging in Russia as early as Kronstadt, if not earlier, and the emasculation, if I can use a sexist term, of the Soviets, a process that continued throughout the 1920s, even before Lenin's death, and that was opposed by left communists, particularly in the Italian Communist Party, I'm thinking of Amadeo Bugiga, and in the German Communist Workers' Party, the KPD, and people like Jan Appel and Bernhard Reichenbach, people who for the most part disappeared so long ago that even their names are largely forgotten today. But what they did was fight against the degeneration of the Russian Revolution and articulate a vision of Stalinism as counter-revolution. So this is a communist left that has to be sharply distinguished from the Trotskyist left opposition during the same period, because whereas Trotsky saw even Stalinist Russia as a workers' state, a degenerated workers' state, but a workers' state nonetheless, the communist left saw it as a capitalist and an imperialist state. And I would say the hallmarks, political hallmarks of the communist left were a rejection of electoralism or parliamentarism in any form, the idea that one could seize state power electorally or legally, the idea, a rejection of trade unions as having become organs of capitalism for the control and subjugation of the working class, for the containment of the working class. This basically all goes back to August 1914 and the abject capitulation of the Second International and the trade union movement as imperialist war broke out. There was also, in the historical communist left, certainly in the German left, a rejection of nationalism in any and all its forms as the bedrock of capitalism in that period, certainly in the period of war. One can not imagine capitalism's survival without patriotism. And so these were the hallmarks of the communist left. And they constituted, for the groups with which I worked, as what we call class lines. Lines that separated the historical interests of the working class and communism from the basic and fundamental interests of capitalism in this epoch. Internationalist Perspective began, I would say, defending those basic positions that I've tried to very briefly outline, but also beginning to undertake what we called a renaissance of Marxism, in which we were definitely not alone. I mean, one of the results of it is the lead article in the most recent issue, a Marxist critique of Marxism. The idea being that traditional Marxism, orthodox Marxism, and here I'm not talking about political positions primarily, whether it's parliamentarism or the unions or nationalism. I'm talking about fundamental understanding of the implications of Marx's own manuscripts for the critique of political economy, most of which remained unpublished until very recently in the New Mega edition, what the Germans call the Neue Marx-Lektüre, a new reading of Marx, which has been made possible by the publication of all of the manuscripts that Marx wrote. I don't want to get into exhaustive detail, because I promised you I would keep it brief. But for example, Volume 3 of Capital, which I think all militants see as a critical text, the version that we all cut our eye teeth on, is the version that Engels edited. And frankly, it's a version that in many respects bears little relation to Marx's manuscript. People like Michael Heinrich, Hans-Jürgen Backhaus, Reichelt, will attest to the fact that when you read the manuscripts now published, you get a totally different view of Volume 3. Questions that were unanswered in the text are answered in the manuscript. Now, I don't want to come here to condemn poor Engels. I think to a large extent Engels wanted a more readable, more accessible text, one that wouldn't put too many demands on the readers. But I think in doing that, he excised or eliminated key issues in the text. And the same thing is true of Volume 1. Backhaus talks about the fact that when he was a student in Frankfurt in the 1960s, he came across the first edition of Capital, never republished until the Mega edition. Some parts of it, and the first chapter is crucial, and so is the appendix, are available in English translation, thanks to some Trotskyists from New Park Publishers. But basically, there are elements there in Volume 1 that the reader of the Penguin translation or the International Publishers translation of Lawrence and Wismar simply do not get to see, because the manuscript was changed to make it more accessible to its intended audience in the 1860s and 70s. And the same thing was true of the Grundrisse, which is a seminal text, but really only saw the light of day relatively late. For most of us, not until the 1960s was it possible to even get hold of a German edition of the Grundrisse, because the published text in 1939 in Russia, well, there weren't too many people who were reading the Grundrisse in 1941 as the German armies approached Moscow. It just wasn't at the top of the So until Roman Roszkowski discovered, by chance, a copy, the existence of the Larissa was unknown, and the same thing is true of the famous sixth unpublished chapter. So what I'm trying to articulate here is that when we talk about Internationalist Perspective, talks about Renaissance of Marxism, it entails reading those texts not as archivists, not for Marx studium, no, but as reading those texts because of what they can tell us about the trajectory and the logic of capitalism in the 20th century and today in the 21st century. Elements that were not visible to even the communist left in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and that was certainly not visible to the Second International or even the Third International, quite apart from the political issues to which I've already alluded. What these texts make it possible to see, in our view, is that capitalism today cannot even reproduce the working class. It cannot even provide the basic necessities that seemingly were available to a working class, say during the 1950s and 60s, the period of Reconstruction after World War II, or that seemed to be available to the working class in the 1890s. What we are witnessing today, and I think Marx's manuscripts make it clear, is the massive expulsion of human labor power from the productive process on an accelerated scale. One can talk about the creation of a planet of slum that extends from Los Angeles to Bombay, to Shanghai, to the cities of East and West Africa, to Rio and Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires and Caracas. And this is due to the logic of capital itself, which is, on the one hand, propelled to expand and develop the productive forces at an accelerated rate, replacing human labor with machines, technology, dead labor, even as the extraction of surplus value depends on the continued subjugation and extraction of surplus value from living labor. This is the moving contradiction that Marx speaks of in the Grundrisse. That on the one hand, capital is compelled to expel living labor from the production process, and on a vastly expanding scale. And on the other hand, is dependent on the extraction of surplus value from living labor. This contradiction that was already apparent to Marx 150 years ago has burst upon the scene over the course of the 20th century on such a scale that today any hope of reforming capitalism, any hope of moderating these tendencies within the framework of the value form is a hopeless utopia in the negative sense, in the sense of an illusion or a delusion. It's not that people don't believe it's possible. Andre Gortz, for example, before he died, spoke of the ultimate reform, a guaranteed annual wage for every human being on the planet. Sounds good. Who wouldn't want a guaranteed annual wage paid by the state? The problem is, on the basis of what wealth creation could such a guaranteed annual wage even be thought of, let alone actualized, in any capitalist society today? I mean, forget about Brazil, forget about China, forget about Africa, forget about Iran, forget about India. It couldn't be actualized in Germany. The basis for such a guaranteed annual wage could only be the continued extraction of surplus value from living labor and the profits on the world market. Failing that, a guaranteed annual wage is simply a pipe dream in the true sense of the word. And yet there are progressives and leftists and socialists who claim that that is the response to the crisis through which we are living today. And as absurd, I would claim, as the guaranteed annual wages, so is the claim of jobs for all. It too is a pipe dream, no less in India or China or Brazil as it is in Germany or Greece or Spain or Italy. In the end, capital has only one course, and that is austerity, in one form or another. There is no alternative. And one of the things that we believe, Internationalist Perspective believes, that Marx's manuscripts make clear is that as long as the value form is not directly and immediately attacked and overturned, as long as wage labor is not immediately abolished, the course of capitalism is a course towards the planet of slums that we can already see arising in every city of the world. That is the stark contrast that we face. And in that sense, one primary task, I've said, we talk about a renaissance of Marxism, is a theoretical task, namely to clear away the illusions and beliefs in reforms of some kind or other, of which nationalism, patriotism, the flag, reforms, jobs programs, guaranteed annual wages, whether they are profited by the left or the right, whether they come from populists on the left or populists on the right, whether they are red or black, come down to the same thing, an attempt to prolong the agony of capitalism in a situation where that agony can only end in more and more misery for the human race. Even the idea, which is one of the core concepts of traditional Marxism, that technology and science are neutral, that they are used or wielded by the working class just as they can be used or wielded by capital, is a fundamental mistake, which I think, again, if one reads Marx's manuscripts, it becomes clear to what extent science, as it has developed historically, specifically in the capitalist world over the past several years, and the technology it has spawned, are yoked to the value forms. They are not neutral. They cannot simply be appropriated by the working class or by socialists. They portend the very disaster of which I was speaking, ecological disaster on a massive scale. So one has a total combination. Ecological disaster on one horizon, and on the other horizon, a planet of slums. And the only way to respond to that, we believe, is through the abolition of wage labor, the destruction of the value form. And that is what, for us, constitutes a renaissance of Marxism. Now, we intervene in all mass struggles, an issue devoted to the Occupy movement, a pamphlet devoted to the Occupy movement. We intervene where there are populist struggles on a nationalist basis. A pamphlet on Chavismo is a good example. Chavismo is, for us, the ultimate attempt to save capitalism in Venezuela, a model for the humiliation and defeat of the working class. But the theoretical task is what underpins the political positions that we articulate, including the illusion that existed just a couple of years ago. This is an issue from 2011. Can China save capitalism? I mean, the illusion then, of course, was that capitalism is booming in China, and China will be the savior of American capitalism. Well, if anything, capitalism is probably doing better in the United States today than it is in China. And for the Chinese working class, the Chinese model is a horrific model. But to answer the question, can China save capitalism? I think the same kind of bubble that was pricked in the United States and in Europe in 2008 is building in countries like China. And it is only a question of time, probably a very short duration, before the property bubble in China bursts and the Chinese economy begins to crash as the American economy did in 2008. And I guess just to end the jobs report for this last month, which the Obama administration expected would produce several 100,000 jobs, didn't even produce 100,000. And if you add the number of people who simply have left the job market, and you understand that the books are cooked in such a way that unemployment is grossly underestimated in this country, what we saw in the last month was a considerable growth in unemployment. What capitalism has going for it is its promises of reforms, which in some countries come from the right, and in other countries come from the left. And I guess the way to end this is just look at the Occupy movement a couple of years ago. A movement full of promise, and the Internationalist Perspective was there in New York and on the West Coast. But look at how it was transformed over the course of the last year into basically part of the electoral machine for the Democratic Party and for Barack Obama. And then think about Obama's capacity to impose austerity. We don't have to leave Chicago. Obama's man, Rahm Emanuel, is eviscerating the school system of Chicago. I doubt that a Republican could accomplish what Rahm Emanuel can accomplish. I doubt that a Republican in the White House could accomplish what George Bush would have liked to have accomplished. Drone attacks on the scale that we see them under the Obama administration. What is going to happen on the Korean Peninsula in the next few weeks? We do not know. But American imperialism is well served by the Obama administration. And it is that reality that is so important for Internationalist Perspective and others like us to get across. Thank you. No, it's fine.
All right, so this workshop is scheduled to end at 3:20. It's 2:22 now, so we've got about an hour for questions. I've been told that the moderator is to take the first question in these, and then I'll open things up to the floor. So for the question, Alan, I just wanted to ask, you spoke about the necessity for an immediate abolition of the value form in order to promote capitalism. In what way does or would this abolition of value be politically and socially realized immediately rather than sort of transitional? And who would carry out this abolition?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. In our last issue, there is an article that I happen to write on communization, and it's based on a critique of Marx's own critique of the Butler program from 1875, where he articulates this vision of a period of transition, a lower and a higher stage of communism, a lower stage in which the value form is not abolished, and in which remuneration is based on one's contribution in labor to the social fund. It, in other words, is a period of transition based on the continued existence of value, the continued existence, I would argue, of capitalism. I don't want to get into the question of why Marx had this vision that he had in 1875, because we don't live in 1875. I don't believe that if we did exist in 1875, we would necessarily or automatically have taken issue with Marx on this question. But we do live in 2013, and it seems to us that the value form cannot wait and continue to exist during a lower stage of communism, which can last for decades, as Marx envisaged it back in 1875. So what form would it take? If you can envisage a revolution that overthrows the capitalist state, call it a dictatorship of the workers' councils, if you will, call it a dictatorship of the proletariat, though I think the understanding of the proletariat is different today than it would have been in the Fordist era or in Marx's era. But one can imagine a situation in which one would immediately begin to get rid of value production. I mean, just to take the most obvious flaw in Marx's vision in the Critique of the Productive Program, two workers each contribute 10 hours of work a day, but one worker has 6 children, and the other worker is a bachelor or a bachelorette. I mean, is it really thinkable that one worker would get the same out of the social fund as the other worker? Is it really possible not to change the accounting, the distribution of the wealth that the working class creates in such a way that the labor time the worker contributes is not the basic factor that determines the share of the social wealth that the worker receives? Why can't things like public transportation or housing be made freely available? Perhaps it's in short supply, and it can be rationed, it can be auctioned off in such a way that there is a lottery for who gets it based on need. There are a lot of alternatives to labor time accounting, which is the law of value. And that does not require a period of transition. It demands, I think, immediate action. And I think one saw certain signs of this, even in Russia in 1917, although within a year or two it had disappeared and money wages had replaced it, and the law of value was intact in Soviet Russia, even under Lenin. So what we are envisaging is basically immediate steps to eliminate labor time accounting in whatever form it might take, whether it's a monetary wage or labor vouchers, which is the way many on the communist left envisaged it in the 1920s. I think we are past the point where we can survive as long as labor time accounting, which is capitalism, continues to prevail in the production and distribution of wealth. Do I have all the answers? No. But I think we have to begin to seriously consider how it would be possible to abolish value production immediately and not as the outcome of a long period of transition. So that helps.
Greg?
I guess 2 decades stand out from your introductory remarks in my view, in the 1920s and 1970s. And in between that, we've had the publication of manuscripts and the Platypus. I want to go with the imagined scenario in which these manuscripts had been published, and in which Marx had had the time to publish all 6 volumes of Capital. Would this have changed anything, actually? Would this have changed anything in the way that Marxists perceived leftist politics in the 1920s? And the second part of it is, isn't this Renaissance in the 70s not rather an academic Renaissance rather than a political one?
Well, so far it has been largely an academic renaissance. That's true. That it remains an academic renaissance for Marx scholars would be a tragedy in our opinion. And the most important thing then is to broaden the access to these manuscripts and the interest in them way beyond the academy. That, I think, is the primary task. Would their publication have changed anything? Look, Marx himself accepted the advice, shall we say, of Engels not to publish the manuscripts as they were. He probably saw the changes made in Volume 1 of Capital, Volume 3 of Capital, as necessary. And would readers have read it the way readers can read it today, with the experience of 2 world wars, a crisis on the magnitude of the 1929 crisis, and now the end of the Fordist era and the crisis that we are in the midst of today? Probably not. I don't think you can leap over your own shadow. I don't think that even had all of Marx's manuscripts been available, that it would have changed much of anything in the way history went. I think there were certain historical junctures politically where opposition to the Bolsheviks in Russia at the time of Kronstadt had a chance to prevail. But in terms of understanding the full implications of the value form and the crisis that it has unleashed, or even the full extent to which science and technology are yoked to the value form, we probably wouldn't have seen it if we had read these manuscripts 100 years ago or 80 years ago, perhaps even at the height of the Fordist era. It just wouldn't have computed. But we're not there. We're here. And I think today, these manuscripts and what they can potentially tell us immediately resonate with the experience of millions of workers. Can resonate. And I think it's important to broaden the discussion so that they do resonate. But I'm not making the claim that all would have been well if only Marx had said to Engels, look, I don't want to dumb down Volume 1. I like what I wrote in the manuscript, because in all probability Marx himself would have been marginalized. It just would not have had the impact that it can potentially have today because of the experience that we've had. I mean, if I can just prevail on you for one moment, my own personal experience was meeting a number of comrades when I first became involved in politics, in the anti-war movement at the time of Vietnam, and came to the conclusion that national liberation struggles portend disaster to the countries where they occurred. And I met comrades who had lived through Kronstadt, who had lived through the 20s and 30s, who had an experience at a time when revolutionary hopes were at their high point. And one of the comrades I met, and it's unforgettable, he lived in France during World War II. He was hunted by the Gestapo, he happened to be Jewish and a revolutionary, hunted by the Gestapo during World War II, distributing pamphlets calling for turning the imperialist war into a civil war. And then, as soon as the Allies liberated France, and the Stalinists were now in the government, he was put on trial by the French government as a traitor because he had opposed, in the leaflets he had distributed, the wonderful cry of the Stalinists: everyone get your own Bosch, your own German, your own dirty German. As the German army was fleeing France in 1944, the resistance was turning its guns on German soldiers who had thrown away their weapons, shooting them in the back because they were just dirty Bosch. This was the propaganda of the Stalinist party, of people like Aragon and Paul Eluard, hyper-patriotic propaganda wrapped in the tricolor. And so here is this communist who avoids the Gestapo and who would have been sent to Auschwitz had he been captured, and then avoids the hangman. Why did he avoid the hangman? Because the judge who he was brought before knew him from the 1930s as a revolutionary, who was a member of the Socialist Party, and for some reason decided to oppose the Stalinists who were clamoring for his death. I mean, to me, it is a perfect illustration of what communists have gone through in the 20th century. That's just a way of getting back to the point I was making about the political issues and the importance of recognizing what I would call these class lines.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to just press you a little bit more. You mentioned that you felt like there might be some differences in terms of an understanding of the dictatorship of the proletariat in Marx's own time, before his time, and possibly you might say today. And I was wondering, could you expand a bit on that question?
Well, I guess in two senses. Very often, particularly in the course of the 20th century, the dictatorship of the proletariat has become the dictatorship of the party. And that seems to us the way Stalinism emerged in Russia on the basis of Lenin's own thinking, even in State and Revolution. This was not a dictatorship of the workers' councils. It very quickly became a dictatorship of the Bolshevik Party. And the full weight of it was borne by the working class, not to speak of other classes, the peasants in particular. But certainly the full weight of it was borne by the working class. So that was one element. One doesn't want to use a term like dictatorship of the proletariat unless you clarify that it is not a party dictatorship that you're talking about. But the other thing is that the proletariat is today not the proletariat of the 1950s and 60s, and not the proletariat of the early 20th century. It is not the industrial proletariat. It is not the blue-collar proletariat exclusively, as it once was. It's what Marx called the Gesamtarbeiter, the collective worker. And it would include today school teachers. It would include today many people who are computer programmers. It would include a broad swath of the working class that was certainly not part of the proletariat as most people envisaged it 50 years ago. And so I prefer a language that speaks of the collective worker than a language that resonates with an image of the blue-collar worker and the blue-collar worker alone. Because more and more wage work today is not blue-collar wage work. That is dying in the advanced capitalist economies, but it is not going to be replaced by a huge wave of blue-collar labor, even in countries like China or Brazil or Russia or India. Increasingly, it will be this Gesamtarbeiter, which is a much broader swath of humankind, but which is, I think, what Marx understood by the working class or the proletariat.
I mean,
The wage working class. The class that has nothing but its labor power to sell. The class that has no reserves. The class that has been violently separated from any and all means of production through which it could reproduce itself. Only the wage remains. Or, if you are part of that increasingly large mass of humanity that will never get a job, it's the dole, or it's crime, or it's charity, or it's living on the street. Because there is no market for one's labor power to an increasingly large extent today. I don't know if that answers your question.
I mean, it seems from that maybe the idea of by defining the proletariat in terms of blue-collar workers, that's more of a sociological kind of category than an economic category. And I wonder whether really maybe in even still today among some people, but whether that is, I mean, if Marx was maybe needing something more general in terms of like people that sell their labour time.
I think that's exactly what Marx meant, and that is how I would define the collective world. Yeah.
Yeah, I like your remarks on the Obama administration. And then there was this article I was reading about this global warming rally in which everyone was saying, well, Obama's really, he wants to stop the Keystone Pipeline, even though it's Obama exclusively who has done the Keystone Pipeline. So I was wondering, one, why is the left unable to criticize Obama? Why can't they recognize him for what he's doing? It seems to be that, if you start criticizing Obama, it's like, oh, this is absurd. No, of course he's like a leftist. And then second, once the realization that Obama isn't what he purports to be, how will we prevent people from moving to alternative voices such as fascism or other political parties that are counterproductive to kind of revolutionary strategy?
Well, I think that is a danger. For some reason, I'm more optimistic about the possibilities of averting a sharp turn to the right than I would have been even a year or two ago. But that doesn't make me more optimistic. For me, for Internationalist Perspective, Obama's re-election was no shock. It was what we expected. And I would almost say it's a watchword. In terms of the way politics shapes up in most countries, but let's focus on the advanced, so-called advanced capitalist countries. I'm talking about Europe, Canada, the United States. It seems to me the real danger in terms of the ability to control the working class always comes from the left and not from the right. I mean, just imagine what Tony Blair managed to accomplish in the UK with New Labour. And if Obama's politics and the politics of the Democratic Party are cut from any cloth, it's Tony Blair's New Labour. It is a policy, okay, for Tony Blair, it is neoliberalism that New Labour embrace. The rhetoric changes a little bit, because today one wouldn't expect the rhetoric coming out of the White House to be that of neoliberalism. But what are the policies of Bernanke? What are the policies of Paul Krugman? What are the policies that Obama embraces? There's a rhetoric of regulation, redistribution of income, opposition to austerity. But if you look around, austerity is what we are witnessing in every city in the United States. I mean, think of the evisceration of the school system in Chicago under Mayor Emanuel. It's a perfect example. Obama may have the rhetoric of a progressive, but he's an integral part of the capitalist class, and his politics are a reflection of that. He is the candidate of Wall Street. All during the election campaign, people talked about Romney as the candidate of Wall Street. I mean, it struck me as absurd. The candidate of Wall Street was Barack Obama, not Romney. Maybe they were thinking of George Romney, his father, who might have been a candidate of Wall Street 30 or 40 years ago. But in this election campaign, that was not the case. And the candidate of the ECB, the European Central Bank in Italy, was the Democratic Party. That is to say, the ex-Stalinists in Italy. They were the candidate. That was the candidate of the ECB. As I'm sure Andreas can tell you, the government that the ECB loved was the government of PASOK in Greece, the Social Democrats. The left is the preferred option, I think, of capital. Until it can no longer accomplish what it needs, then it may have to look elsewhere. But I don't think the immediate perspective in Germany or in France or in the United States or in Canada is on the far right. I think it's on the left. Just look at Francois Hollande in France, imposing the austerity program he ran against just a little over a year ago. I mean, this is what the Socialist Party does in country after country. We don't have a Socialist Party in the United States. We have the Democrats.
Pam?
I have one comment and one question. One comment was about, you briefly mentioned the role of technology in science, and you were emphasizing so much about the need to overcome the value form that I just thought to myself how difficult that would be, the overcoming of the value form, specifically like the abolition of necessary labor time, without using like the past labor of humanity, i.e. machinery and science and technology, towards the object of that abolition. So when you mentioned that, I thought maybe you would explain what you mean, because you said it, and then you said, if you look at the history of its development alongside capitalism, it has not been towards, the abolition of the value form, but isn't that precisely what a revolution would transform? So in that sense, wouldn't there be like a change? But the second question, I recently listened to an interview with your comrade, I believe his name is Neil Fisher, in April of last year, and he, like you, I think, emphasized two things: the abolition of this rhetoric of the transitional period from capitalist society to socialist society, but also his distance from the Trotskyist movement, specifically in relationship to the party. And he articulated what the party meant in that interview as people who have the blueprint and want to impose it, and that, at that time, what was the fraction within the ICC decided that that's not a perspective that they wanted to sign onto. But I wondered what, by differentiating yourselves from that Trotskyist perspective, as it was put in the interview, but what is the conceptualization of the party there? Because it seems very much, I would argue, it seems very different than what Lenin was talking about, certainly. It seems as if the imagination is of a small group of people who have figured it out, and then they go out to the working class and sort of tell them what to do, right? The blueprint, right? Like underlining that blueprint. But in fact, one of the footnotes that I like to quote, like maybe too much, but it really struck me about Lenin is this footnote, I think it's in State of Revolution, when he talks about the workers, of course, enter the party, but they enter the party not as workers, but they enter the party as prud'hommes, as veuglings. They enter the party, that is, as party members, as disciplined party members. And so it's not that the workers can't be in the party, but rather they transform themselves by subjecting themselves to the discipline of the party. That, I think, is very different than, at least the way in which your comrade put it, of what the party looks like. So that, my question is, I guess, about, what do you imagine the party to be, or to be differentiating yourself from this articulation, and what the kind of council communist perspective that you seem to be adopting, or at least seem to be empathetic with, what is that offering in relationship to that kind of transformative experience that a party would offer?
Okay, so first, capitalism and technology. We are not technophobes. Our vision is not to go back to the 19th century or even earlier. The question is how to uncouple technology from the value form. I think some of the most innovative developments in technology hold out a promise for liberation of humankind from the value form and from the sweat of our brow as the basis for human existence. But historically, technology and science have developed within a framework of the emergence of capitalism, have been yoked to the value form, and the ecological destruction that we see all around us is evidence of that. Now, how to decouple technology? What would I even hesitate to use a term like a liberating technology. In Ernst Bloch's writings, there's a lot of interesting attempts to articulate the vision of a new kind of technology that would be uncoupled from the value form. It's very general and very vague in Bloch's writings, but it focuses on the problem, which is simply that technologies link and science's link to the value form has to be broken if the promise of a liberatory technology is ever to be realized. Technology as it exists today is not neutral so that we can simply appropriate it intact as it is. And I'm talking about the conceptualization that underlies technology and science, not simply specific scientific or technological breakthroughs. It's not about whether we should have automobiles or airplanes. It's about the idea of subjecting nature to the simple will of human beings as if it was nothing other than an object for our subjugation and control. That, I think, is what underlies the evolution and the development of the historical specificity of technology and science in the capitalist epoch.
Control?
Yeah. And it dovetails with all the other facets of capitalism, which are about the control of humankind, just as technology and science are about the control, the mastery of nature. I think the technology, Locke calls it a co-productive technology, a technology that doesn't simply subjugate nature, but works with nature. Now, it's something that has to be developed, and I think there are anticipations of it all around. But I think the primary point is to break the idea that all we have to do is take technology and science as it presently exists, and we have communism as long as we get rid of Wall Street and the banks. We don't. We have capitalism. So that's the first part. Now, the second part, I didn't hear that interview with Neil, but I mean, the word party is bandied about. Internationalist Perspective doesn't call itself a party. We're a group of pro-revolutionaries. We intervene in ongoing struggles, strikes, occupying movements, protest movements, social movements, and wherever we intervene, our aim is to bring a certain theoretical perspective based on class lines that I have articulated, and based on an understanding of the value form and what it portends for humankind unless we can abolish it. How does it differ from Trotskyism? I mean, it seems to me that every Trotskyist group imagines itself as the embryo of a future Bolshevik party that will become the dictatorship of the party in a communist revolution. And as I tried to explain, that is not at all our vision. We don't anticipate or envisage ourselves as becoming the leaders of the revolution, as having the blueprint for the revolution. We have ideas that we want to expose in ongoing struggles in very concrete terms about how to link the ongoing struggle, whether it's the Occupy movement or a teacher's strike, to the value form and the need to overturn it. But that's very different from a conception of ourselves as the future party state or the future party that will instantiate the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's not our vision at all. I don't know if that helps, I hope.
I don't know. Well, I was trying to bring out the Lenin as a way of getting you to talk about. So in Lenin's account of what the party is, which, you know, then we can sort of disagree or agree whether or not that's right. But in his account of the party seems to be offering a particular formative experience for anyone, right? So this is why he says, well, of course workers can be part of the party, right? But they don't do so as workers per se. They enter the party, and as they enter the party, they become part of a kind of way of making sense of society and a way about thinking of like the mastery of society by human beings for human beings. The other things that you were mentioning, I don't necessarily disagree with, the kind of like democratization of production and like, you know, the kind of councils that then, like in Russia, were formed so that those decisions about how to democratize production can happen at that level. But it seems like Lenin was saying something about a party that was meaningful that I don't think is about blueprints. I think it's about a kind of like understanding of history and a perspective about how to work towards abolishing capitalism, i.e. how to work towards abolishing necessary labor time, i.e. how to work towards abolishing the state that happens through the party and through reflecting on the possibilities of revolutionary activity. So I guess maybe we have a fundamental disagreement of the definition of a party. It seems like for you, it's like the workers are here and the party is this other thing. Workers can't be also part of the party. So
No, not at all.
So it has
if I led you to that view, then it's my fault. The problem isn't that workers can't be members of the party.
Let me rephrase. I actually think you're right. That's right. Because your comrade said something like, you know, the problem in something like Stalinism is not a fault like Stalin per se. And he said the problem is that we create, or that the left has created these sort of structures in which then you recreate things like, he said, the cop or the manager or like the person who is like overseeing, you know, processes in society. So, but isn't that, I mean, and maybe we get into this rhetoric of the transitional period again, and this is exactly what you're trying to like avoid, but at least let's figure out a debate about it, because it seems to be about that specifically. Like, how do you create a moment in which like you could push towards the international organization of a working class, towards not just to recreate the working class, right? Because you keep emphasizing that it needs to work towards the eradication of the value fund. But that doesn't happen just because people get together in councils. So how can that actually happen? Like, from where is there a kind of direction, a kind of movement direction, right? Like a direction towards that overcoming? Does it come like specifically through just the form of the council? Like, where is that coming from?
No, the form of the council guarantees nothing in and of itself. I would say one has to step below the point you started at. Lenin's own vision in what is to be done is that the working class can only achieve a trade union consciousness. That it is the professional revolutionaries who bring consciousness to the working class. In our view, it is
But the working class can become that.
Any worker can become a professional revolutionary.
So it's a moment in the revolutionary activity.
No, but the working class in and of itself cannot go beyond this trade union consciousness. Okay? I would argue that there is no reason to think that the collective work of today has to be locked into a trade union consciousness. The consciousness of the necessity for communism is just as omnipresent within any ordinary worker as it is in any professional revolutionary. And the problem with Lenin is that for him, the worker was excluded from that kind of consciousness until or unless he accepted she accepted the discipline of the party and the program of the party. That is the flaw in Lenin's vision, I would argue. So it begins with this idea of the inability of the collective worker to become conscious of the world in which it lives and the steps that need to be taken to abolish the value form.
All right, Sudi, and then back Jeremy.
I suppose I have a lot of difficulty recognizing what you have clubbed under the rubric of traditional Marxism and all of the writings of Marx that Marxists had, the only writings that they had to contend with before the publication of Mega, where it does seem to me that Marx foresees, even in the manifesto, the creation of a Lazarus lair, which is more than a lair, in fact is an enormous surplus of the human population, which you didn't have to come to the creation of slum cities to be able to see. But if we set that aside, I suppose I have a question about the category of traditional Marxism itself. And in your presentation, there are gestures, of course, that you made to Kronstadt, to council communism, that particular tradition, and various other moments, and yet there is the category itself of traditional Marxism seems to dismiss the history of Marxism for the better part from Marx to the present, or certainly to the 1960s, seemingly, until the discovery of the Grundrisse by the New Left. And so I was wondering how the International Socialists see themselves, how they understand the history of Marxism. And within that, I have a question about the idea that until these manuscripts were found, and until the publication of the full set of manuscripts, we were somehow unable to understand the value form and its myriad complexity. And I wonder if within that there isn't a certain philosophy of history that's, that I could ask you to fully explicate. We would have a conception from, say, Lukács, certainly, of the idea that in fact, with the passage of time and through the process of reification, that it's become more opaque rather than more transparent. Right? And so, would you have to explicate perhaps a philosophy of history of the international perspective there?
Well, I certainly don't want to deny the importance and the significance of the living Marx and the visions and political programs he articulated while he lived. But capitalism isn't static, and Marx had to anticipate developments. And I think much of what I talked about that is contained in the manuscripts are developments that have occurred since Marx's day, and that resonate with us today because we can see our reality in what he wrote then, even though much of it was not put in the published text. Now, on the Industrial Reserve Army, yes, Marx anticipates that, but did he anticipate a situation in which this reserve army would swell to the point where it would encompass ever larger masses of humankind, where no matter how cheap labor became, it would still not be employable by capitalism because of this tendency of capital to expel ever greater numbers of laborers. Marx was envisaging a world in which periodically the Industrial Reserve Army swelled in order to reduce the cost of labor and the value of labor power. He certainly understood that very well. But I think contained in these manuscripts is more than that, a recognition of an ineluctable tendency within capitalism to go way beyond what he called at that time, in the published text, an industrial reserve army. This is now a permanent mass, growing exponentially. And I think what Marx's manuscripts make it possible to see is A, not only how it has grown, way beyond what Marx could have anticipated, or did anticipate, but how the logic of the value form compels capitalism to continue on this trajectory, even when it creates a massive problem for capital itself. I mean, when Marx said capital was a moving contradiction, what he meant was, I think, as capital expels labor power from production, it is nonetheless still dependent on living labor for the extraction of surplus value. And that contradiction becomes more and more intense. It creates the possibility for workers to appreciate that the future cannot be solved by reforms or by a new government in power that will create jobs, by a jobs program, such as progressives of the left promise in every electoral campaign. That what it portends is a situation not unlike the one Mike Davis describes in his Planet of Slums. And that is the future that capitalism holds. I think when workers recognize that, and they don't need a Leninist party to recognize that, it begins to become possible to understand how the promise of reform is duplicitous, how the promise of reform is a trap, how the promise of reform is an illusion. But I certainly didn't intend to say we can throw out everything that Marx wrote except for these manuscripts, far from it. I simply meant that they make it possible to see things that the published texts did not make easily accessible, and that we should be using them because of what they can tell us about the world we live in today in a way that wasn't clear 100 years ago.
And therefore, my other questions about the implicit history of philosophy of history that's implicit in such an understanding of how it is the case that, between Marx and the actual writing of these manuscripts and the rediscovery of them, one conducts, how did one conduct politics in that intervening century?
Well, I think it was a century in which some of the issues we confront today didn't exist. I mean, if what you're asking me is, would I have been in the German social democracy in 1890? My answer is, I wouldn't have looked at the world with the eyes through which I look at the world today. I wouldn't have had the consciousness that I have today, because that consciousness is born of the very developments and the triumphs and the defeats of the working class over the past century. Would I have been in the German social democracy in 1890? Probably. I think I would have been in the left wing. I think I would have been with Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Would I have seen in August 1914 that the enthusiasm with which the Social Democrats embraced the Kaiser's war was a trap, was a betrayal of the working class? I'd like to think I would have been with Karl and Rosa at that moment, and not with the leadership of the social democracy. But it's a question that nobody can answer.
But is that something that the category traditional Marxism then, does that not efface all of that history? There were these, one would have to get into the history of Marxism to be able to understand the positions of...
And divisions. And the way in which, certainly they're grappling with, what you put as overcoming the value form. It's not something that they couldn't see. Or is that the position that you're articulating? I suppose I'm asking for...
Are you asking me if I think the SPD in Germany saw the need to overcome the value form in the 1890s? Or
yeah, I suppose I'm asking...
In 1914, my answer would be an unequivocal no. That's why they wrapped themselves in the German flag. It wasn't even the flag of 1848 in the Republic. It was the Kaiser's flag. And that's why the French socialists wrapped themselves in the tricolor. Were there socialists who opposed them? Yes, there were. And what I just said was I would hope, had I lived then, that I would have been with that minority. But does it mean that the SPD was incorporated into capitalism in the 1890s and the early 20th century at that penultimate moment in August 1914? Yes, it crossed the class line it became an integral part of the capitalist state when it voted for the war credits. Yes.
I guess what students, sorry, like, I just want to,
Nate has, look,
okay,
let's try to have
it's fine.
different speaking. So, Nate in the back, I think, and then.
Yeah.
We have about 10 minutes left, and then Jeremy.
Sure.
Brian, I'm sorry to.
I'm just going to move away so I don't, pick up too much on the mic there. So I guess my question, taking a slightly different tack or taking up a different thing. I mean, I agree that the Democratic Party is the true enemy of the people, but when you were discussing Occupy, I mean, you sort of described it in terms of like, it early on like sort of had kind of promise because it was like very skeptical of like the electoral process, and that's later been compromised. And I guess like my question for that though is that, I mean, the history, like historically, Marx wasn't just dealing with a crisis in the value form, like sort of very narrowly understood. In other words, there's also like the question of Bonapartism, the question of and later taken up as a question of imperialism. In other words, pointing to sort of like the crisis of liberalism, including like a crisis of like electoral politics, historically. And so, I mean, I think that, I do agree that like there were lots of like kind of, for lack of a better word, like sectarian or kind of entrenched sorts of, kind of canned responses to Occupy from a lot of like leftists and Marxists. But it seems to me also that, there's a way in which there was a way in which like, obviously I wouldn't have wanted like Occupy to like from the beginning just be like for one side or the other, but there is a way in which like they actually avoided dealing with the crisis of electoralism. That actually might be, in that sense, viewed as a conservative response to just sort of want to like abjure any form of like political mediation. And so my question for you then is like, where do like, sort of political demands come in? Because like, abolishing the value form, I agree like on like an abstract level, but it seems like there's a lot of questions in terms of how that would be articulated politically, given especially that, like liberalism's in crisis. That's not only purely a matter of like people not being able to work, it's also a question of like, what would true democracy even be or look like? So that would be like my, in other words, are demands for true democracy simply like bourgeois ideology or fetishism in your view? My second question, shorter and a bit more pointed but related, would be, did the Soviets or the workers' councils directly attack the value form, and if so, how? And likewise, did the rebellion Kronstadt sailors? So those would be my two questions.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to maybe I should answer the last part first, okay? I don't want to turn Kronstadt into a utopia. There were undoubtedly a lot of problems in the Kronstadt revolt, but the basic impetus for it, as I understand it, as Internationalist Perspective sees it, is a classic confrontation between the emerging party state and the councils of Soviets. And on that issue, there could only be one position. The right of the Soviets had to prevail over the needs and demands of the party state. But there's a framework for this. I mean, Kronstadt had been preceded by a whole history of the isolation of the revolution in Russia. It had been preceded by decisions within the Bolshevik Party to focus on anti-imperialist struggles, the experience of the Baku Congress, which celebrated the anti-imperialist struggle when it could have been argued that the struggle of the working class in Central and Western Europe was far more important than the struggle that was emerging on the peripheries at that time, particularly when at Baku there was a willingness of the Bolsheviks to tolerate the most reactionary slogans on the part of the representatives gathered at Baku. reactionary in terms of the treatment of women, reactionary in terms of the treatment of minorities, reactionary in terms of yoking political Islam to the Russian Revolution. That whole context has to be taken into consideration. So it seems to me, without glorifying Kronstadt happened. It marks, I think, a nail in the coffin of that revolutionary wave. But we're not going to get anywhere refighting the Kronstadt we wrote today, because we live in a different epoch and a different situation. So that gets back to the first part of your question, which if you could just briefly recapitulate the moment.
Sure. I mean, basically, at heart, you can discuss this, specifically with respect to Occupy, but also just more generally, that yes, there's the question of like abolishing the, value form, but, looking back at this history, it's the crisis of the value form isn't simply it isn't purely one of just unemployment, but can also be understood in terms of a crisis of liberalism, which is something that's drawn attention to with Bonapartism, which is something that obviously Marx was concerned with. He coined the term. So in other words, what would Marxists or what should Marxists say about that? Or what form of sort of politics?
Right. One of the most exciting things about Occupy, speaking from personal experience, and I saw it firsthand both in Manhattan and in the Northwest, was what perhaps we could call democracy. The unwillingness to cut off debate, the unwillingness to limit what one could raise as issues for discussion. It was vibrant, it was alive. There was nothing that was off limits. On the other hand, there was, right from the beginning, I think, a sense that simply having this democracy in the park was itself enough, that it was itself a victory. I think it led to tactical decisions that perhaps, in retrospect certainly, but even at the time, should have been different, allowing us to be boxed in by the police. That day on the Brooklyn Bridge, for example, everybody has probably seen the video, which was very striking. You remember with the Occupy sign on the building as thousands of people crossed the bridge, or am nobody seen that? Okay. Right?
The bat signal.
What? The bat signal. Right. Very, very striking. But that was a moment where most of the crowd wanted to say to the police, we're not staying on the path that you have allowed us to walk on. We're coming on to the whole of the bridge. We're occupying the whole of the bridge. This is not your space, it's our space. And they were kept by the monitors, not by the police, but by the monitors, on that narrow little pathway, penned up and locked in. I think that was both tactically and strategically a huge mistake. There was a possibility of an occupation of a considerable part of the New York waterfront at that moment. It would have been transformative for the Occupy movement, but it didn't happen. So I think there were tactical mistakes and strategic mistakes that were made in the midst of this vibrant, living democracy. The problem wasn't the democracy. The problem was there were elements in the Occupy movement that were quite prepared to cooperate with the forces of law and order, with the police, with their directions, that wanted the movement to be lawful. After all, the occupation of the park itself was due to a fluke. The contract with the city guaranteed that the park had to be open 24/7. Okay? Had the Occupy movement decided to occupy any other park in New York, the police would have been there at 9 p.m. or in some parks at the latest midnight, and that would have been the end of the occupation. That was a tactical decision that was made, not by the occupiers. That decision was made before the occupation. I don't even want to get into the question of where the decision to occupy and where the decision to go was made. I'm not talking about conspiracy, but it certainly wasn't the decision of the people gathered in the hall. That had already been pre-decided. So the problem is not the democracy. The problem is, what does the democracy do, and what constraints and what limits, including legalization, lawfulness, respect for the authority of the police and the judicial system. And so that was one thing. Yes, you could talk about the value form, and we did, and others did as well. But one of the things I encountered very quickly, and it's probably unavoidable, were Tea Party people who were in the Occupy movement in Manhattan, and who were talking about the danger of the state, and how our Second Amendment rights are about to be taken away from us, and how we need Ron Paul to be elected president. It was a motley crew, not simply a blueprint for future actions exclusively. So, I mean, I don't know if that account dovetails with what you were trying to ask me. I hope it did. Because I don't see the form, democracy, as a guarantee or a panacea. It is a prerequisite. I can't imagine a movement that is controlled by one party or one group having any chance, or a strike controlled by a committee of the trade union having any chance. But I also don't see the democratic form as a guarantee of success, or even a flourishing of the movement in and of itself.
All right, well, Jeremy, I'm sorry, it's 3:20 now. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I would hope to do a few more questions, but anyway, thank you everybody for coming, and make sure to pick from the program the next workshop to go to here. They're 3 from 3:30 to 5 p.m. In the 13th floor lounge. There's Roger Rashi from Quebec Solidaire. In the 14th floor lounge, John Beecham from the Party for Socialism and Liberation will be speaking. And also in the 14th floor lounge, still correct?
No, it's going to be here.
Or here will be Elmar Fletcher here from Exit in General. So.
Oh, it's gonna be here, so that's a change.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Please, if you're interested, take some of this subversive propaganda, so I don't have to go through security with it and end up in Guantanamo Bay, although Cuba will be warmer than Chicago.
Thank you very much.